The crisp autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves as Ethan Montgomery stepped out of his sleek black Cadillac at Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the neatly arranged headstones, and a gentle breeze rustled the branches of the towering oak trees. He adjusted the cuffs of his tailored suit, taking a deep breath before walking toward the familiar grave, the resting place of Isabella Montgomery, the woman he had loved more than anything. It had been 5 years since Isabella's passing, yet the grief remained as fresh as ever. Every year on this day, Ethan made this solemn pilgrimage, away from the high-stakes world of corporate boardrooms and billion-dollar mergers, to honor her memory in quiet solitude. But this time, something was different. As he neared the marble headstone, he noticed a small figure curled up beside it, a young boy, no more than 6 or 7 years old. The child sat on the cold ground, arms wrapped tightly around his knees, his thin, faded jacket barely shielding him from the chill. His brown hair was tousled, and his pale face bore an expression of deep sorrow, as if he belonged there in his grief. Ethan's brows furrowed. It was rare to see strangers near Isabella's grave, he had made sure of that. His wife had been a private person in life, and he had fiercely protected her memory in death. Clearing his throat, he spoke in a firm but measured voice. "Hey, kid. Are you lost?" The boy flinched slightly but slowly looked up, revealing a pair of deep brown eyes, eyes that struck Ethan with an unexplainable familiarity. There was something haunting in them, something that sent an eerie sensation crawling up his spine. The boy shook his head. "No," he whispered, voice barely audible. "I came to see my mom." Ethan's breath hitched. He must have misheard. His heart pounded in his chest, a cold wave of unease washing over him. "You're what?" he asked, his voice suddenly unsteady. The boy hesitated, then lifted a small hand and pointed to the name engraved on the marble. Isabella Montgomery. Beloved wife and daughter. Ethan felt the world tilt beneath him. His mind scrambled for an explanation. Isabella had never been pregnant. He would have known. They had spoken about children, had dreamed about it, but life had gotten in the way, his long hours, their silent sacrifices, and then, the accident. She was gone before they ever had the chance. Yet here stood a child, a stranger who bore her eyes, her delicate features, her quiet sadness. Ethan knelt, his polished shoes pressing into the damp earth. His voice, usually commanding and confident, now came out in a whisper. "What did you say?" The boy sniffled, rubbing his sleeve across his nose. "She was my mom," he repeated. "She used to visit me before she went away." A sharp, painful chill raced down Ethan's spine. His pulse roared in his ears. If what the boy was saying was true, then Isabella had hidden something monumental from him. A secret child. A part of her past he had never known. His hands clenched into fists, his carefully composed demeanor beginning to crack. Who was this boy? And why had Isabella never told him? Ethan Montgomery sat in his dimly lit study, the soft glow of a banker's lamp casting long shadows across the mahogany desk. A half-empty glass of bourbon rested beside a stack of old photographs, each one a frozen moment of Isabella's life, each one now taunting him with unanswered questions. Who was this child? Why had Isabella never told him? The weight of the revelation pressed down on him like an iron hand. Ethan had spent years believing he knew everything about his late wife, her hopes, her fears, her dreams. Yet here was a boy, Noah, sitting at her grave, claiming she was his mother. If it was true, it meant Isabella had kept a life-altering secret from him. But why? Gripping his phone, Ethan scrolled through his contacts and pressed Daniel Reeves' number. If there was anyone who could dig up the truth, it was Daniel, a former NYPD detective turned private investigator. The line rang twice before a gruff voice answered. "Montgomery. This must be important." Ethan exhaled sharply. "I need you to look into something. A boy named Noah. He's about 6 or 7 years old, living in a shelter in Brooklyn. I need to know everything: who his parents are, how he got there, and most importantly, if he's connected to Isabella." There was a pause, then Daniel replied, "I'll see what I can find. Give me a day or two." Ethan hung up and leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. The waiting gnawed at him, each minute stretching into an eternity. Had Isabella been forced into this situation? Had she been protecting the child, or protecting him from the truth? By the next evening, Daniel was standing in Ethan's office, a manila folder clutched in his hand. His expression was unreadable as he set it down on the desk. "You're gonna want to sit down for this." Ethan swallowed hard and flipped open the folder. The first page stopped him cold. Noah's birth certificate. Mother, Isabella Montgomery. Father, left blank. His breath hitched. No listed father. But why? His fingers tightened around the paper as he turned the page, scanning through the case reports from Child Protective Services. Noah had been abandoned at St. Mary's Shelter when he was just a newborn. Abandoned. Ethan felt a lump form in his throat. Isabella, his Isabella, had left her child at a shelter? It didn't make sense. She had been compassionate, deeply loving. If she had carried this child, how could she have walked away? Daniel cleared his throat. It gets more complicated. Turns out Isabella visited him regularly. Not often enough to raise suspicion, but she never stopped checking in. Ethan's mind reeled. She knew. She had been part of his life, in secret. Then why hadn't she told him? Daniel continued, the shelter matron, Margaret Whitmore, might have answers. She was the one Isabella spoke with the most. Ethan stood abruptly, already reaching for his coat. Then let's go find out the truth. Ethan Montgomery sat in his penthouse, staring out at the vast expanse of New York City. The lights of Manhattan flickered like a sea of stars, but tonight, the city felt different, more distant, more suffocating. In his hands, he held Noah's case file, its pages filled with cold, bureaucratic language that reduced the child's life to a series of dates and incidents. He had read it over and over. Born in a small clinic in Brooklyn. Left at St. Mary's Shelter days later. No known relatives. No official guardian. Isabella's name appeared only once, on the birth certificate, and nowhere else. Why had she kept him a secret? Why had she left him? Ethan wasn't a father. He had never planned to be. His life revolved around power and control, building companies, making deals, securing his legacy. He knew how to handle billion-dollar mergers, but what did he know about taking care of a child? And yet, when he had seen Noah sitting by Isabella's grave, shivering in that thin jacket, looking so heartbreakingly small, something had shifted inside him. A quiet, unfamiliar instinct. A need to protect. The next morning, Ethan found himself at St. Mary's Shelter, a modest brick building tucked between two towering apartment complexes in Brooklyn. Inside, the air smelled of disinfectant and old books, and the walls were lined with faded posters reminding children to dream big and never give up. Margaret Whitmore, the shelter's director, was a sharp-eyed woman in her 60s. She folded her hands on the desk and studied Ethan carefully. "I was wondering when you'd show up." Ethan frowned. "You knew who I was?" Margaret nodded. "Your wife told me about you. She made me promise never to contact you. Said it would be too complicated. A bitter chuckle escaped Ethan's lips. Complicated? She had a child, and she never told me. She left him here. How does that make sense? Margaret sighed, leaning back in her chair. Isabella loved that boy. She came when she could, even if it was only for a few stolen moments. But she was afraid. She thought bringing Noah into your world would destroy everything. Ethan clenched his jaw. She should have let me decide that. Margaret's gaze softened. Maybe she knew you weren't ready. Those words stung, but deep down, Ethan couldn't argue. Would he have accepted Noah back then? Or would he have resented him, seeing him as an obstacle rather than a son? Ethan stepped out of the shelter, his mind in turmoil. Across the street, Noah sat on the front steps, his hands stuffed into his too big jacket. He looked up when he saw Ethan, his expression wary, expecting rejection. Ethan swallowed hard. He had a choice to make. Walk away, leave Noah in the system, let someone else take responsibility. It would be easier. He had no obligation. Or take him home, change his life, change both their lives, and step into the unknown. He let out a slow breath and crossed the street. Come on, kid. Let's get you someplace warm. Noah hesitated, then slowly slipped his small hand into Ethan's. And just like that, Ethan Montgomery, a man who had spent his life running from attachment, made a decision that would change everything. Ethan Montgomery had built his empire on knowing every possible outcome before making a move. He didn't like unanswered questions. And right now, there was one question gnawing at him, keeping him up at night. Who was Noah's father? Isabella had left the father's name blank on the birth certificate. That was no accident. She had wanted to keep it a secret. But why? Had it been a mistake from her past? A relationship she regretted? Or was the truth something far worse? Ethan needed answers, and he knew exactly where to start. That morning, he placed a call to Daniel Reeves, his private investigator. Find out who fathered Noah. I want names, dates, anything that connects him to Isabella. Daniel, always professional, asked only one question: how deep do you want me to dig? Ethan didn't hesitate. All the way. While Daniel worked, Ethan tried to focus on business, but his mind kept drifting back to Noah. The boy had been with him for over a week now, slowly adjusting to life in the penthouse. At first, he had been silent and guarded, as if expecting to be sent away at any moment. But over time, he had started to settle in, watching cartoons in the mornings, curling up with a book in the evenings, and even giving small, hesitant smiles. Ethan hadn't expected how much those little moments would affect him. He wasn't just responsible for Noah's shelter and food, he was responsible for his future. And part of that future depended on knowing where he had come from. 3 days later, Daniel called back. You're going to want to sit down for this. Daniel's voice carried an edge of caution. Ethan clenched his jaw. Just tell me. There was a pause, then Daniel dropped the bombshell. The most likely candidate? Victor Harrington. Ethan froze. His grip on the phone tightened. Victor Harrington. A name that commanded power, respect, and fear. Victor was a ruthless billionaire investor, a man known for crushing his competition and eliminating obstacles without hesitation. Ethan had crossed paths with him before in the corporate world. He was not someone you wanted as an enemy. But could he be Noah's father? Ethan flipped through the documents Daniel had sent over. A buried hospital record showed that Isabella had once requested a paternity test for Noah but had never followed through. That meant she had doubts, strong enough to seek confirmation, but something had stopped her. What had she been afraid of? Ethan exhaled sharply. He didn't have to guess. If Victor knew he had a son, he wouldn't let that information sit idly. He would act. And Ethan had a sinking feeling that he wouldn't like Victor's definition of fatherhood. Ethan's thoughts raced. If Victor Harrington was Noah's father, that meant one of two things. Victor never knew. In which case, Ethan had the upper hand, for now. Victor knew and had chosen to ignore it. If that was true, why? And what would change if he suddenly decided he wanted Noah? Ethan turned toward the living room, where Noah sat on the couch, flipping through a book. He looked small, innocent, completely unaware that his very existence could start a battle between two powerful men. Ethan wasn't sure what his next move should be. But one thing was certain, he wouldn't let Victor Harrington claim Noah like he was some corporate asset. Noah deserved more than that. And Ethan would fight to make sure he got it. Ethan Montgomery had faced some of the toughest negotiations in the corporate world, multi-billion-dollar deals, boardroom battles, high-stakes takeovers. But sitting across from Noah, trying to explain the truth about his father, felt like the hardest conversation of his life. The boy sat curled up on the leather couch, a book resting forgotten in his lap. Outside, the New York skyline glittered against the darkening sky, but inside, the room was eerily quiet. Ethan took a deep breath. "There's something we need to talk about, kid." Noah glanced up, his brown eyes cautious. "What is it?" Ethan hesitated. He had rehearsed this in his head a dozen times, trying to find the right words. How do you tell a child that the man who fathered him was one of the most ruthless businessmen in the country? Finally, he just said it. "I found out who your father is." Noah blinked, processing the words. Then, slowly, he sat up straighter. "You did?" Ethan nodded. "His name is Victor Harrington." The boy's face scrunched in confusion. The name meant nothing to him, at least, not yet. Ethan leaned forward. "He's a powerful man. Very wealthy, very influential." He paused before adding carefully, "And he doesn't know about you." "At least, not yet." Noah's fingers tightened around the edge of his book. "Why not?" Ethan exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "Your mom never told him. She must have had her reasons." Noah frowned, his small hands balling into fists. "Did she think he wouldn't want me?" The question hit Ethan harder than he expected. Because wasn't that the fear lingering in Noah's voice? That he hadn't been wanted, not by his father, maybe not even by his mother? "No, kid," Ethan said firmly. "I don't think that's it. I think she was protecting you." Noah swallowed hard. "From what?" Ethan hesitated. How much should he tell him? That Victor Harrington was a man who saw the world as a chessboard, where people were just pieces to be moved, used, or discarded. That if he found out he had a son, he might see Noah as just another asset to control? Instead, Ethan softened his voice. "Some people, when they have a lot of power, they don't always make the best choices. Your mom might have been afraid of what would happen if Victor knew about you." Noah was quiet for a long moment, staring at the floor. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "So, do you think he would have wanted me?" Ethan's chest tightened. He had spent his life closing deals, solving problems, but he had never felt more powerless than he did at that moment. "I don't know," he admitted honestly. "But what I do know is this: you're not just someone's responsibility. You're not a mistake or an afterthought. You're Noah. And no one gets to decide your worth except you." Noah blinked rapidly, looking away as if trying to hide his emotions. Then, after a long pause, he whispered, "What happens now?" Ethan leaned back. "That's up to you." Noah looked at him, searching his face. "Do I have to meet him?" Ethan shook his head. "Not if you don't want to. It's your choice." For the first time since the conversation started, Noah seemed to relax, just a little. Because maybe, for the first time in his life, he wasn't being forced into someone else's plan. He had a say. And for a boy who had spent his whole life being left behind, that meant everything. Ethan Montgomery had been expecting this moment. The minute he uncovered the truth about Noah's father, he knew it was only a matter of time before Victor Harrington came knocking. Men like Victor didn't stay in the dark for long. If there was one thing Ethan had learned in his years in the corporate world, it was that power-hungry men always found a way to claim what they believed was theirs. And Victor Harrington was no exception. That morning, Ethan was in a meeting at Montgomery Industries headquarters when his assistant rushed in, looking pale. "Sir, Victor Harrington is here." Ethan barely reacted. He set his pen down and exhaled slowly. "Right on schedule." "Where is he?" "In the lobby." "He demanded to see you." Ethan stood, adjusting his suit jacket. "Bring him to the conference room. And make sure we're not disturbed." Victor was already seated when Ethan entered the sleek, glass-walled conference room. The man hadn't changed. He still radiated power and control, the kind that made lesser men nervous. Dressed in a custom-tailored navy suit, he looked every bit the billionaire mogul that he was. His piercing blue eyes met Ethan's, calculating, assessing. Ethan closed the door behind him, his expression unreadable. "Victor." Victor smirked. "Ethan. I hear congratulations are in order." Ethan remained silent, refusing to take the bait. Victor leaned forward, lacing his fingers together on the table. "You've been keeping something from me. Something rather important." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Is that so?" Victor's smirk vanished. "Cut the games, Montgomery. I know about the boy." There it was. The confirmation that Ethan had been waiting for. Victor sat back, his voice turning colder. "Noah is my son." Ethan crossed his arms. "And?" Victor narrowed his eyes. "And I want to meet him." Ethan let out a slow breath, suppressing the urge to slam his fist on the table. "You want to meet him? Now? After 7 years of never even knowing he existed?" He scoffed. Where was this fatherly instinct when Isabella was alive? When she was struggling? Victor's jaw tightened. "I didn't know about him. Isabella never told me." Maybe she had a reason. Ethan shot back. "Maybe she knew what kind of man you are." Victor's eyes flashed with warning. "Watch yourself, Montgomery." Ethan stepped closer, his voice dangerously low. "No, you watch yourself, Harrington. Noah isn't a business acquisition. He's not some stock option you can claim when it's convenient for you. He's a kid. A kid who's been through hell." Victor's expression remained unreadable, but Ethan could see the tension in his jaw. Finally, Victor exhaled. "I don't expect him to run into my arms. But he deserves to know the truth. He deserves to know who I am." Ethan studied him for a long moment. Then, his voice was steel. "Noah will decide that for himself." Victor's eyes darkened. "And if I decide to fight for custody?" Ethan's blood ran cold, but he didn't flinch. "Then you'll find out just how far I'm willing to go to protect him." A long silence stretched between them. Two powerful men locked in a silent battle. Finally, Victor smirked. "I see why Isabella loved you." He stood, adjusting his cufflinks. "Give Noah my message. If he wants to meet me, he knows where to find me." Ethan didn't move as Victor walked to the door. Just before stepping out, Victor turned back. "You may think you're protecting him, Montgomery. But one way or another, the truth always comes out." Ethan clenched his jaw as the door shut behind him. He already knew that. The question was Noah ready for it? The restaurant was quiet, an upscale Manhattan establishment where the wealthy dined in hushed conversations over candlelit tables. Ethan Montgomery sat beside Noah, his presence a steady anchor as the boy stared out the window, watching the traffic on Fifth Avenue below. His small hands gripped the edge of his chair, his knuckles white. Across from them, at a corner table, sat Victor Harrington. The billionaire investor looked exactly as Ethan had last seen him, polished, powerful, unreadable. He had the air of a man who had never once been denied anything in his life. But tonight, for the first time, he looked unsure. Noah's voice was barely above a whisper. "So, you're my dad?" Victor studied him, his blue eyes sharp yet guarded. "Yes." Noah didn't react at first. He simply stared at the man, his expression unreadable. Then, after a long pause, he asked, "Did you know about me?" Victor exhaled, folding his hands on the table. Noah's voice was calm, controlled. "I found out recently." If I had known, he hesitated, then shook his head. "Things would have been different." Noah tilted his head. "How?" Victor didn't answer right away. Ethan watched him closely, waiting to see if he would dodge the question. Instead, Victor leaned forward slightly. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I wouldn't have ignored you." Noah blinked, processing the words. Wouldn't have ignored him. It wasn't a declaration of love, nor was it an apology. It was just a fact. Noah's fingers curled into the fabric of his hoodie. "Why did my mom leave me at the shelter?" Ethan saw the flicker of something, pain, maybe even regret, cross Victor's face. "Your mother made choices she thought were best." His voice softened, just slightly. "She was trying to protect you. Maybe even protect herself." Noah frowned. "From you?" Victor didn't deny it. "From the world I live in." Silence settled over the table. Ethan, who had spent years navigating high-stakes negotiations, could feel the weight of this moment, two strangers, bound by blood but separated by years of absence. Noah finally asked the question that had been lingering on his mind. "What do you want from me?" Victor's lips pressed into a thin line. Then, in a voice that lacked its usual authority, he answered, "Nothing." That surprised both Ethan and Noah. Victor leaned back, his gaze steady. "I don't expect you to trust me. I don't expect you to like me. But I want you to know I'm here. If you ever want to know me, I won't turn you away." Noah looked at him for a long moment. Then, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the letter Victor had given Ethan days before. "I haven't read this yet." Victor nodded. "You don't have to. Not until you're ready." Noah hesitated. Then, he tucked the letter back into his hoodie. Ethan studied him, trying to read the boy's thoughts, but Noah kept his emotions guarded. Finally, Noah said quietly, "I don't know if I want to know you." Victor didn't flinch. "That's your choice." The waiter arrived to clear the table, but the meal had been largely untouched. As Ethan guided Noah toward the exit, Victor remained seated, watching them go. Just before they stepped outside, Noah glanced back. He didn't say anything. Neither did Victor. But for now, that was enough. The late autumn air was crisp as Ethan Montgomery stood on the balcony of his penthouse, a steaming cup of black coffee in his hands. The New York City skyline stretched before him, glittering in the fading light. Behind him, inside the sleek, modern space that had always been his sanctuary, Noah sat curled up on the couch, flipping through a book. It had been 2 weeks since Noah had met Victor Harrington. 2 weeks of silence on the subject. Noah hadn't mentioned his father, nor had he expressed any desire to see him again. The letter Victor had given him remained unopened, tucked inside a drawer in Noah's room. Ethan hadn't asked about it. He knew the boy would read it when, and if, he was ready. Ethan took a slow sip of coffee, his mind drifting to how much had changed. His once immaculate penthouse now felt different. There were signs of life scattered everywhere, a half-finished jigsaw puzzle on the dining table, a hoodie tossed over the arm of the couch, an empty juice box on the counter. Small things. But they meant something. They meant Noah was starting to belong. As Ethan stepped back inside, he found Noah watching him. "You okay, kid?" Ethan asked. Noah hesitated, then shrugged. "Yeah. Just thinking." Ethan sat across from him, setting his coffee down. "About?" Noah fiddled with the corner of his book. "Victor." Ethan leaned forward slightly. He had expected this. "Do you want to see him again?" he asked carefully. Noah exhaled, then shook his head. "Not yet." Ethan nodded. "That's okay." Noah looked up, uncertainty flickering across his face. "Do you think he really wants to know me? Or is it just because he feels like he has to?" Ethan took a long breath, choosing his words carefully. "I think he regrets not knowing about you sooner. But whether that means he'll be the father you deserve, that's something only time will tell." Noah nodded slowly, then murmured, "What if I never want to know him?" Ethan met his gaze. "Then that's your choice." Noah studied him for a moment. "And you? You're not going to leave, right?" Ethan's chest tightened. For a kid who had spent his life being left behind, this wasn't just a question. It was a plea. He reached across the table and placed a firm hand on Noah's shoulder. "I'm not going anywhere, kid." Noah's small fingers clenched around his book, as if holding on to something unspoken. And then, for the first time, he smiled. It wasn't big. It wasn't confident. But it was real. As the city hummed around them, Ethan knew the story wasn't over. Victor Harrington wasn't the kind of man to walk away so easily. One day, Noah might want answers. One day, he might open that letter. One day, he might choose to meet his father again. But it wouldn't be today. Today, Noah was just a kid figuring out his place in the world. And Ethan? For the first time in years, he wasn't just a man with power, money, and influence. He was something more. He was Noah's home. Life rarely unfolds the way we plan, and sometimes, the most unexpected turns lead us to where we truly belong. Ethan Montgomery never saw fatherhood in his future, yet in embracing Noah, he discovered a deeper purpose, one that no amount of wealth or success could replace. His journey reminds us that family isn't always about blood, but about the choices we make and the love we give. For many, regret lingers over missed opportunities and unspoken words. Victor Harrington learned too late that some relationships can't be built on obligation alone. His story teaches us that acknowledging our past mistakes is only the first step. True redemption requires action. Noah, the child at the heart of it all, embodies resilience. Though abandoned and uncertain, he found his voice, his agency, and ultimately, his place in the world. His story is a reminder that we all deserve to be chosen, to be loved, not as a duty, but as a conscious decision. At any stage of life, we are faced with choices: to show up, to forgive, to embrace new possibilities. Sometimes, the greatest acts of courage aren't grand gestures, but simply choosing to stay, to care, and to love.